Welcome back to Story Junkie, the channel where real stories cut deep and the truth hits harder than fiction. There's a moment, and if you've ever had your whole life dismantled by someone you trusted, you'll know exactly the one I mean. When rage stops feeling like an emotion and starts feeling like a skill, a tool, something sharp and purposeful that you can pick up, aim, and use with both hands. I found that moment at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, sitting in my car in the parking garage of a building I used to work in, reading an email that had been sent from my own account, an account I hadn't opened in 6 days, an email that had been sent to the board of directors of Midmar Technologies, detailing, in meticulous, devastating, and completely fabricated detail, how I, Grace Ward, senior security architect, had been stealing proprietary source code and selling it to a competitor. My name, my signature, my email address, my digital fingerprints, planted so carefully it looked like art. I sat in that cold car for a long time, long enough for the parking garage lights to cycle off and back on again, long enough to stop shaking and to understand, fully and completely and without a single shred of remaining doubt, who had done this to me and why. Then I drove home, made a full pot of coffee, the strong kind, because I understood instinctively that I was going to be awake for a while, sat down at my desk and started planning. Because here is the thing about being a hacker, a real one, not the Hollywood kind with glowing green screens and dramatic music and hooded sweatshirts and motivational speeches about freedom of information. The real kind is patient. The real kind knows that the best attacks don't look like attacks at all. They look like accidents or justice or nothing at all. They look like something that simply happened, inevitable as weather, obvious in retrospect, impossible to trace back to a human hand. I had all the time in the world. I had a full pot of coffee, a quiet apartment, and a desk I'd worked at for 4 years, and a mind that, when it got very still, became very dangerous. I got very still. I'd been at Midmar Technologies for 4 years when it happened. 4 years of 12-hour days and weekend sessions, and the kind of quiet professional pride that comes from building something that matters, and knowing it matters because you can see the results in clean data. I was the architect behind Midmar security infrastructure, not just the visible stuff, the firewalls and the access controls and the compliance reports that made auditors comfortable, the deep infrastructure, the bones. I knew where every vulnerability was because I'd found them all myself and sealed them. I knew every backdoor, every weakness, every quiet digital seam in the system that could be pulled apart if you knew exactly where to tug. I was, without false modesty, the best person they had. Under my watch, Midmar had maintained a zero breach record, zero successful intrusions in 4 years of increasingly sophisticated attack environments. In an era when major tech companies were being compromised every other quarter, our competitors hired consultants to study what we were doing. I had built myself into something the company could not easily replace. I understood now, with the clarity that only comes after catastrophe, that this had made me more valuable to them as a scapegoat than I had ever been as an employee. Jake Cummings was the reason I had the job in the first place. We'd met in grad school, both of us in the computer science program at Carnegie Mellon. Both of us the kind of people who thought sleep was an optional activity and argued about encryption protocols at parties and took genuine, unironic pleasure in finding elegant solutions to problems that other people didn't even recognize as problems. He was brilliant in a broad, restless way, the kind of mind that could see connections across disciplines, could take an abstract and deeply technical problem and reframe it in language that a non-technical audience could understand and get excited about. I was different. I was precise and methodical and technical in a way that went bone deep. I wasn't good in rooms with executives. I was good in rooms with servers. I was good at the part of the work that happened after the meeting, alone, in the quiet hours when everyone else had gone home. We balanced each other perfectly, or so I had believed. The thing I know now is that when two people balance each other in that particular way, the one who is better in rooms with executives tends over time to accumulate more power and people with more power. Faced with a choice between using someone and protecting someone, often find the calculation less difficult than you'd hope. We dated for 2 years before he joined Midmar. A year after that, he brought me in, vouched for me personally, walked me through the interview process, told me over dinner that night that he'd made the case to Norma herself that I was the hire that would change the trajectory of the company's security posture. I believed him, and I was grateful. For 3 years after that, we were both genuinely happy at work and at home and in the life we were quietly building together. Or at least I was genuinely happy. I know now that I missed things. That is what makes betrayal so particular in its cruelty. It doesn't just hurt you in the present tense, it goes back and retroactively corrupts the past, so that every good memory becomes a question. You find yourself standing in the wreckage of your own history, unable to tell which pieces were always broken and which pieces just broke. What I missed? Jake had been unhappy for longer than I knew. He had been ambitious in a direction I hadn't understood. He had been conducting a quiet, careful relationship with Norma Keene, our CEO, for approximately 18 months before everything fell apart, and Jake, it turned out, had probably always had a plan in one form or another, and had simply been waiting for the right moment to activate it. Norma Keene was the kind of executive who appeared in Forbes profiles and gave TED Talks about visionary leadership while quietly running the most ruthless operation I'd ever seen from the inside. She'd founded Midmar 10 years before I arrived, had taken it from a 2-person startup operating out of a rented office in Pittsburgh to a 200-person corporation with offices in 4 cities and contracts with some of the largest technology buyers in the country. She had done it by being smarter than almost everyone around her and more willing than anyone to do what other people wouldn't. Her biography was the kind that gets described as relentless by admirers and ruthless by people who'd been in her way. I had respected her once, genuinely, the way you respect something dangerous because it is also undeniably impressive. She and Jake together were a different kind of dangerous entirely. The plan, I would only piece this together later, bit by bit, as I dismantled the evidence they'd planted and found the scaffolding underneath, was elegant in its cruelty. Midmar was positioning itself for acquisition, a major deal with a European defense contractor worth north of $800 million. The acquiring company had one non-negotiable condition: clean IP, no legal encumbrances, no cloud of corporate malfeasance hovering over the company they were about to absorb. The due diligence process would be exhaustive. They needed Midmar to be spotless on paper. Norma needed someone to be the stain, specifically a scandal that had been identified, named, and removed, proof that the company policed itself, that bad actors were caught and excised before they could do lasting damage, that Midmar's internal governance was robust enough to catch even sophisticated, trusted insiders. A sacrifice dressed up as accountability. Someone who looked, on paper, like they had both the access and the motive to steal proprietary code, and someone whose removal would demonstrate exactly the kind of institutional integrity the acquiring company wanted to see. Jake nominated me. I imagine it was easy for him, and this is the thought that cut deepest, the one I returned to in the raw hours of those first weeks, that he didn't even struggle with it for long, that he chose me not in spite of how much I'd trusted him, but because of it. Because I was the one person at Midmar with enough access to enough critical systems that framing me would be technically believable, because I was the one person whose credentials he could access without immediately raising alarms, and if I were accused, might be too devastated by the betrayal to fight back effectively. He underestimated me on that last point. He always underestimated the still part of me, the part that under pressure goes quiet and starts working. 6 days after the fabricated email was sent to the board, I was called into a meeting with HR and the company's outside legal counsel. I sat across from 3 people who wouldn't look me in the eye while they explained what I had allegedly done and why my employment was being terminated effective immediately and what the company's legal obligations were in terms of reporting my alleged misconduct to law enforcement. They slid a folder across the table. Inside the folder was the email, my words, or something close enough to my words that only someone who knew my writing very well would clock the slight wrongness of it. My signature block, formatted exactly the way I formatted it. I asked one question: may I see the access logs? That information is part of an ongoing internal investigation, the lawyer said. I nodded. I picked up the copy of the termination letter, thanked them for their time, which was perhaps the strangest thing I have ever done. I stood up and walked out. Jake walked past me in the lobby on my way to the elevator. He was coming from the direction of Norma's office, carrying a coffee and a folder of documents, and he was wearing the expression of a man who was very busy and very important and had places to be. He glanced at me, then looked at the floor. He didn't say a word. I pressed the elevator button and waited and thought about the coffee he was carrying and about how it was the same brand we used to order together. I thought about how grief and rage, when they hit you simultaneously, don't feel the way people describe them. They feel like cold clarity. I sat down with a legal pad and a fresh pot of coffee, and I worked out, methodically and without sentiment, exactly what had been done to me, exactly how it had been done, and what I had that they didn't know about. What I had was this. I am the person who, years ago at 2 in the morning, when I was deep in a paranoid phase about the robustness of our backup architecture, created a small and carefully hidden monitoring fork on Midmar's primary code repository. Not for any malicious purpose, just the way any thorough and somewhat obsessive security architect might create a private off-site mirror for true business continuity. A hidden snapshot, technically against policy, in the narrow sense that I'd never documented it or reported it to management, because reporting it would have meant explaining what it could do and triggering a conversation I didn't want to have. But not malicious, just meticulous, just me, being the kind of person who anticipates catastrophic failure and prepares for it quietly. That fork was sitting on a private server in a data center in Ohio, quietly replicating changes and access logs and metadata from Midmar's systems, completely undetected by anyone at the company, because no one at the company had known to look for it. They had revoked my access to Midmar's systems. They had not revoked access to a server they didn't know existed. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was Jake. Specifically, and this still amazes me in a cold and distant way when I think about it, Jake's habits. I had lived with Jake for 2 years and worked alongside him for 4. I knew that he reused passwords with slight variations across personal and professional accounts. I knew he had a private email alias he used for anything he didn't want to be discoverable through normal channels. I knew that his idea of a strong password was a sequence built on his mother's maiden name and birthday, rotated annually on the same date. I also knew he kept his most sensitive documents on a personal cloud storage account he'd had since graduate school, because he fundamentally didn't trust corporate IT infrastructure with his most valuable work, a mistrust that was, in its own way, a form of the same professional paranoia I'd always had, just directed outward instead of inward. I had known all of this in the idle, incidental way you know things about people you live with. I had never thought of it as useful information. Within 48 hours of my termination, I had access to his cloud account. What I found there required me to sit very still for a very long time, longer than the parking garage. There were documents, internal memos drafted jointly by Jake and Norma, mapping out the timeline of the frame in meticulous detail. Early drafts of the fabricated email with revision comments between them. Jake suggesting adjustments to the language to make it sound more authentically like me, noting specific phrasing patterns he'd observed in my professional communications. Norma pushing back on certain technical details, asking Jake to verify that the framing would hold up under the kind of forensic examination an external investigator would conduct. Screenshots of my credentials being tested in a sandboxed environment to ensure the forgery would be technically credible. A calendar entry in Jake's account marked simply GW termination, confirm legal ready. My initials next to a date treated like a project milestone, like a deliverable on a timeline. I've looked at a lot of things in my career. I've looked at intrusion logs and malware architectures and social engineering scripts and the various creative ways that people design systems to harm other people. None of it prepared me for seeing Jake's handwriting on the systematic destruction of my professional life, his particular brand of analytical notation, the same notation I had seen on whiteboards and napkins and the backs of takeout menus for years. Those same marks applied to me, applied to ending me. Something changed in how I understood the situation. It stopped being personal. I know that sounds backwards, but this is true. When something stops being personal, it becomes something you can work with, something you can hold at arm's length, examine with clear eyes, plan around with precision. The grief of betrayal by someone you loved. That is a wound that needs tending separately, privately, in its own time, with its own kind of care. What I was dealing with now was a crime, a corporate conspiracy, a coordinated, documented, deliberate act designed to destroy my career and protect a fraudulent acquisition deal, and I had all the documentation sitting in a cloud account in Jake's name on a server I had no legitimate right to access, which created a problem I needed to think carefully about. Let me be honest with you, I wanted to destroy them, not destroy their reputations in the clean, manageable, socially acceptable way that sounds like something a reasonable person would say. I mean, I wanted to reach into every system I had access to, pull every thread I could find, and unravel Midmar Technologies down to its foundation. I had the access and the capability. I had weeks of free time and more motivation than I had ever had for anything in my life, and the particular focused energy that comes from having been genuinely and thoroughly wronged. I could have leaked the acquisition deal to the competitor, killing it from the outside. I could have released Norma's private communications, not just about me, but about a dozen other things I found when I started looking. Things that had nothing to do with my situation but would have been spectacular in their own right. I could have done any of these things, and a part that ran very hot and very dark in those early weeks, a part that I am not ashamed of but that I am glad I kept separate from the decision-making, wanted to do all of them simultaneously. The thing that stopped me wasn't my own moral character. I want to be clear about that because I think there's a tendency to make these stories cleaner than they are, to present the wronged person as someone who chose justice over revenge from a place of serene ethical clarity. That's not what happened. What stopped me was a picture in my mind, specifically the picture of 187 other people who worked at Midmar. The engineers and designers, the project managers, administrators, and customer support people who came into that building every day and did their work and had nothing to do with what Jake and Norma had decided to do. If I burned the company down, and I mean that literally, in the digital sense, those people went down with it. I thought about all of them. I held their invisible presence against the very real, very specific weight of my own injury, and I found, to my own surprise, that I couldn't do it. I couldn't make them pay for what two people had done. I wanted surgery, precise, documented, targeted, painful for the right people in the right ways, for reasons that could be explained, verified, and held up in the light. Making that decision and then holding to it through weeks of work that would test it was the hardest thing I did in this entire process. Harder than the technical work or the legal process. Harder even than facing what Jake had chosen to do. I spent a week building what I came to think of as the case. Not a legal case yet, though I was already in contact with a lawyer who came recommended by someone I trusted. A digital case. A complete, authenticated, technically unimpeachable record of everything that had been done. How, by whom, and when. The fabricated email was the center of the case, and it was also its own undoing, because a fabricated email, no matter how carefully constructed, leaves traces. The sending server's logs showed activity at a time when my physical access badge had me on a different floor of the building, a floor with no computer workstations. The metadata embedded in the email itself had a header fingerprint that did not match Midmar's standard email client configuration. Most critically, the phrasing of the email, while close to my professional register, was wrong in ways that Jake had not been able to fully account for, despite his familiarity with my work. He knew my vocabulary, but not my sentence rhythm. The email read like me at 95%, which to anyone who didn't know me might have been indistinguishable from the real thing, but which I could read like a forgery the moment I saw it. The access logs I retrieved from the Ohio server confirmed what I'd suspected. My credentials had been used from a device that wasn't mine, from an IP address that resolved to the subnet of Jake's personal development workstation. He'd been careful. He'd routed through 2 intermediary hops, but not careful enough for someone who had spent 4 years building the system he was trying to exploit. The financial records took 2 days. They were not in Jake's cloud account, they were in Norma's, in a folder labeled with a series of numbers that meant nothing until I understood what I was looking at. Payments from an offshore entity to an account in Norma's name that predated my termination by 8 months, structured in a pattern that financial investigators have a specific term for. The amounts were irregular in size but regular in timing, which is the signature of a particular kind of payment arrangement. I am not a financial forensics expert, but I know enough to recognize the shape of what I was seeing. Jake had been paid, not just with promises of advancement or with Norma's personal attention. He had been paid in money, a sum that, when I finally isolated it to a figure, made me laugh out loud at my desk at midnight. He was paid the dollar amount of my professional life, of 4 years of work and 2 years of love, and everything I had built and trusted and believed. I could see it right there on a line in a spreadsheet. I built the case for 3 weeks and then I called Delia. Delia O'Hara has been writing about corporate corruption for 11 years. She is rigorous and careful and constitutionally opposed to anything that could be described as embellishment. She has a rule about sources. She will not use anything she cannot authenticate independently, and she will not run a story she can't defend in court. She is, in the best possible sense, relentless. We'd met at a conference several years before and had maintained one of those useful occasional friendships that exist between people who recognize in each other a particular kind of professional seriousness. She had told me once over drinks at an industry event that the story she most wanted to break was a clean corporate villain, someone guilty of exactly what they're accused of, documented all the way down. No he said, she said, just a villain and a record. I called her on a Tuesday evening and talked for 2 hours. When I finished, she was quiet for almost 30 seconds. Then she said with enormous professional restraint, "Can you authenticate everything?" "Yes." "Are you willing to be named?" That question sat in the air between us for a long moment. Being named meant becoming the story. It meant interviews and public exposure and the particular vulnerability of having your worst and most humiliating moment displayed for strangers to consume and form opinions about. It meant that the narrative of what had happened to me would exist permanently in the public record, searchable, available, mine but no longer entirely within my control. It also meant being the one who said out loud and on the record, with my name attached, "This happened, and here is the proof, and I am not ashamed of having been wronged." There's a weight to that, a weight I found when I actually held it that I wanted to carry. "Yes," I told her, "I'm willing to be named." We worked together for 4 more weeks. Delia brought in Midmar's public financial filings, the acquisition timeline, public records on Norma's corporate history. There was a pattern there, less dramatic than what she'd done to me, but suggestive. A series of departures and restructurings at companies she'd previously led that looked, in aggregate, like what they were. She had a source inside the acquiring company who could speak anonymously to the pressure Midmar had been under to demonstrate clean governance before the deal closed. I provided the technical documentation, the authenticated communications, the payment records, and an expert technical analysis I'd prepared explaining, in terms any jury could follow, exactly how the fabricated email had been constructed. Between us, we built something that wasn't just a story. It was a case file with a byline, but I wasn't done. Jake had something that wasn't part of the professional case and didn't belong in Delia's story. Personal files from the years we'd shared a life, photographs, private correspondence, some of it sensitive in a personal sense, none of it relevant to any professional matter, all of it sitting in his cloud account where I had already been. He'd kept it. I didn't know whether that was carelessness or sentiment or something darker, the instinct of a person who keeps leverage by reflex even when they don't have a specific use for it. I didn't touch it in any way that mattered. I left it where it was, and I encrypted it behind a new security layer he wouldn't notice and couldn't break without knowing what he was looking for. I wasn't planning to use it against him. I wanted a copy just because that material was mine, or had been mine, and something in me needed to take back that one small piece of ground, to put one lock between his hands and the evidence of who I had been when I trusted him. Then I did one more thing. I found the private account Jake and Norma had used to communicate during the planning, the one neither of them had accessed on a corporate device, the one created specifically so their coordination would be off the books. On a Tuesday night, Exactly 4 weeks after the night I'd sat in that parking garage, I sent Norma a message from a new account she wouldn't recognize. It was 3 lines only. I know what you did. I know how you did it. The journalist you're about to hear from has everything. Then I closed the account and deleted it from every server that might have logged its existence, and I never touched it again. I don't know exactly what she did with that message. I know what happened in the weeks that followed. She retained external legal counsel, the kind of expensive and specialized firm you hire when you know something catastrophic is coming and you need to prepare rather than react. She made several internal personnel decisions that, in retrospect, look like someone quietly removing potential witnesses to their own conduct. She had conversations with Jake that I know about because of documents that would later surface in discovery. What I wanted, and I'm honest with myself about this, even if honesty about it is uncomfortable, was for her to experience for a few weeks what I had experienced in that parking garage. The knowledge that something is coming, the knowledge that you cannot stop it, the knowledge that someone else holds the information that will determine what happens to your life, and that you are waiting, and that the waiting is its own particular punishment. I gave her that. I'm not sorry. The story ran on a Thursday morning in March. Exactly 2 months to the day after my termination, Delia had placed it with precision. A major financial publication with the reach to be unmissable by anyone in the industry, the legal backing to protect its sources, and the editorial standards that required Midmar and both named individuals to respond on record before publication. They had declined to comment, which Delia had noted prominently in the piece, which is the kind of note that only requires reading once for anyone with professional experience to understand exactly what it means. I read it at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The story was precise and thorough and restrained in the way that the best journalism is restrained. It laid out a timeline and a set of facts, a collection of authenticated documents, and it let the reader arrive at conclusions the facts made unavoidable. My phone began ringing within the hour and didn't stop for 3 days. Some of those calls I had expected. Former colleagues, good people, people I'd worked beside for years, who called to say they were sorry and that they'd never believed it and that they were glad the truth was out. Friends, my mother, who had been only partially briefed on the situation because I'd been protecting her from the worst of it. My lawyer, who had been very patient for a long time and who said crisply and professionally that she expected to be very busy in the coming weeks. One call I hadn't fully anticipated, a board member from Midmar, a newer member, someone who'd come onto the board during the last round of corporate restructuring, someone who had his own reasons for having been uncomfortable with how Norma ran things and who had apparently been waiting for an external event to provide him with the justification he needed to act. He was careful in what he said, brief and practiced, and clearly operating with counsel in the room with him. But he communicated clearly that the board was treating the matter with the seriousness it deserved, and that my cooperation going forward would be welcomed. 3 weeks later, Midmar's board issued a press release announcing that Norma Keane had resigned, effective immediately, to pursue other opportunities. The language was sanitized to the point of translucency, but anyone in the industry could read it correctly without effort. I read it 3 times. The third time, something that had been wound very tight in my chest for 2 months loosened slightly, in a way that felt less like relief than like the beginning of it. The acquisition fell through. I want to be honest about what that cost, because the collateral damage was real. Roles were restructured and contracts weren't renewed. Approximately 30 people lost their positions in the reorganization that followed. I thought about them. I still think about them. I hold that against the question of whether I made the right choices throughout this, and I don't always arrive at the same answer. The uncertainty is something I carry. Jake's departure came 2 days after Norma's, announced in a 2-line internal email obtained and published by a tech industry newsletter. He had, apparently, the same other opportunities she did. I don't know where either of them is now, and I don't care. The legal process took 14 months. I won't tell you it was clean or fast or satisfying in the cinematic way that justice sometimes appears in stories about justice. It wasn't those things. It was paper and depositions and lengthy stretches of waiting interrupted by intensive periods of document production and technical explanation, and a great deal of time sitting across tables from people who needed me to explain, from first principles, how a computer works, and what it means that a particular action shows up in a particular log at a particular timestamp. I became, by the end of it, very good at explaining things I had previously assumed everyone already understood. My civil suit against Midmar Technologies settled at a figure I am not permitted to disclose, but that was substantial enough to feel real, to represent something more than symbolic acknowledgement. The terms included a formal public statement, wasn't a private apology, but a public, on-the-record acknowledgement that the accusations against me had been fabricated, that the evidence supporting my termination had been manufactured by company employees acting in concert, and that my termination had been wrongful in every legally relevant sense of the word. That public acknowledgement mattered to me more than the money. The money was necessary, and I was glad to have it. But what I needed at the deepest level was a record, something that said, in language that couldn't be revised, this happened, and this is what it was. Jake cooperated with the criminal investigation in exchange for a reduced charge. That is a fact I have complicated feelings about. The person who chose me as the sacrifice became the instrument of the case against the person who had accepted his nomination. There's a particular shape to that irony, and I have sat with it long enough to have some understanding of it, though I cannot say I have arrived at anything as settled as peace. Norma Keene was convicted on 2 counts of corporate fraud and 1 count of criminal conspiracy. She is currently serving her sentence. I know this because the case generated enough public record that it surfaces in my name searches from time to time. My name is in the case record. My initials appear in it next to a date, exactly the way they appeared in Jake's planning documents, in a different context and in a document that will exist as long as that court's records exist. I find that appropriate. I've been asked many times in the period since this all became public and part of the industry's collective memory whether I feel like justice was done. Whether I've moved on, that particularly irritating formulation, as though moving on were a destination you arrive at rather than a direction you keep walking in. I find these questions frustrating in a way I am still working to articulate. They assume that if you execute the process correctly, if you input the right elements in the right quantities, you emerge from the other side with something stable and complete, that the scar fades, that you return to the person you were before. That is not how any of this works. What I have is this. I have a new position at a firm I chose carefully, with people I vetted before I agreed to work alongside them. The work is interesting and the compensation reflects my actual value, and the culture is one in which I am trusted to do my job without anyone second-guessing my every decision. I am, professionally speaking, rebuilding, not from scratch, because the public record of my vindication is part of my professional reputation now. There is one more thing I have. I never deleted the Ohio server. I keep it running, properly maintained, quietly replicating. The original evidence is there, the full case file, every document and log and communication and payment record, archived and encrypted, and sitting in a data center I pay for, out of my own pocket on an ongoing basis. It is not there because I need it. The legal process is concluded. The record exists in court documents. No one is coming for me. It is there because I built it, and I am responsible for what I build, and because I know, and this is the thing that is truest about me, that was always truest about me even when I didn't know it would matter, that you never forget where all the vulnerabilities are. My name is Grace Ward. I was the best security architect in my professional world. I was framed and fired and publicly accused of a crime I did not commit by the 2 people I had trusted most in my professional life, one of whom I had loved. The crime they committed against me was not impulsive, and it was planned, documented, and executed with precision, and it was designed to be undetectable, to destroy my career completely and leave me with no recourse. They were wrong about the undetectable part. They were wrong about the no recourse part, and then I went home, made coffee, and got to work. There are things you cannot hack your way out of. I know that now. The grief is one of those things. The slow and painstaking work of learning to trust again, to sit in a room with someone new without running an internal threat assessment, to take someone at their word and not immediately begin cataloging the ways that word might later be weaponized. That work cannot be automated. It cannot be compressed. Sometimes the most meaningful justice is not the public kind or the courtroom verdict or the press release. Sometimes it is this quieter thing, the knowledge that you were good enough at what you do to see clearly through what was done to you. I want to leave you with one thing that has settled into me over the months since all of this concluded, that has become part of how I understand not just what happened to me, but what it means. When Jake and Norma planned what they did, they made a fundamental error, not a technical error. They looked at me and they saw what I was useful for. They saw my access and my credibility and my 4-year record of excellence, and they saw how those things could be turned against me, and they made their calculation. What they didn't do was see me, the actual person. They treated me like infrastructure, static, predictable, a known quantity whose behavior in a crisis could be confidently modeled. They were the CEO and the rising executive. I was the technical specialist. On the organizational chart, the power differential was clear. In the actual system, I had built everything they were standing on, and I still knew where every weak point was. That is the thing they missed. That is, in the end, what this story is about. It's about the gap between how people see you and who you actually are. The gap between the function you serve in someone else's plan and the full architecture of your own capabilities. It is about the moment when someone mistakes the infrastructure for the person and discovers too late, too publicly, in a way that cannot be undone, that the person had been paying attention the whole time, had been building things, had been keeping records, had been all along exactly the kind of person who does not stay where they're put. My name is Grace Ward, and I am exactly that kind of person. This is a Story Junkie original. Take care of yourself and God bless.